Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. How are you? You're going to hear this just a couple days before my birthday, and I am turning 60 years old this year in 2023. Happy birthday to me. This episode today, I think you're really going to enjoy. It's with Stephanie Gardner Wright, who's an LMSW, another social worker, who specialized in working with highly sensitive people. And recently, I've followed her on TikTok. I saw her on Instagram, and she announced that she's autistic. And because I'm on this new journey, I reached out to her. I'd followed her content for quite some time. And she and another HS therapist who just recently learned that she's also autistic, the three of us have been connecting, and we did a Zoom call together. We've got a text thread. We do Marco Polo. It's just been great. I'm sure that when you discovered you were an HSP, you were hungry to learn about what is it to be an HSP and to be around other HSPs? Well, that's how we're feeling with our autism. So today, Stephanie and I are going to be talking about what are some of the challenges and myths of being a late diagnosed, high masking, assigned female at birth person. And I think it's a great episode. There were supposed to be three of us on this call. We videotaped it, so I make a reference to where I'm looking and what I'm doing. Obviously, this is audio, so you're not going to be able to see it. I don't think we're going to do anything with the video recording. And in this episode, I refer to, in episode 196, when I talked about my autism, my editor commented that I seem very tentative, and I am. I'm using new language. I'm straddling this fence between not wanting to offend the autistic community, not wanting to offend highly sensitive people. And this is not a criticism to my editor because I trust and need her to give me this feedback, but I am very tentative in using this language. I want to be very clear that this episode is not diagnostic. What we do talk about is how long we've been diagnosed, things that we finding are problematic, things to say or don't do if someone lets you know that they're autistic, lots of misnomers. After we finished recording, we asked a couple questions. I'm like, does this happen for you? Does this happen for you? So I've started a list of things that we will talk about in future episodes. Stephanie has a lot more going on than I do, so we're going to try and get some recordings down in the books pretty soon. I think it's fascinating. When we look at neurodivergence, my friend Amy said, until we can look inside somebody's brain after they're no longer alive, we really don't know what's going on in there. And I'm going to assume that everybody here is neurodivergent. It may show up as highly sensitive person. It may show up as autistic. If you're in the autistic community, HSP can feel very ableist. There may be a subtype of autism that is highly sensitive. I don't know. I'm just reporting what I am reading, and I'm so concerned about creating friction or rubbing people the wrong way or invalidating HSP. I'm trying to think. I'm actually redoing this intro, which I hate doing. And I can't remember if I talked about this in the episode or if I'm repeating myself. I don't like having to redo intros, but because I didn't have Stephanie's info and that was my fault, I didn't say anything about it. When you learned that you were an HSP, my guess is that you reviewed your life through the lens of HSP and you felt some relief and normalization. That's the place that Stephanie and I are in right now, of reviewing our life now through the lens of autism and looking at what's HSP, what's autism, how does this show up for us? I think this is a big part, and I want to continue to be open in my autism journey and sharing it with you, to be curious. I've also had a few people reach out to me and say that they suspect that they're autistic. So if this is helping somebody get more information about themselves, my goal is to just educate, to talk about my experience, hope that it resonates for you. I do not have an agenda about trying to get anybody to identify as anything, but I am super sensitive about it. Also, in this episode, I misname her. I thought her name was Samantha Croft, but she has a checklist in Samantha Craft, Craft. I've put it in the show notes if you want to follow up. She's got a checklist of traits that may show up. And I'm pretty sure that it's women who are autistic. I don't know if she specifically says women that are assigned female at birth. I'm really trying to be more mindful and inclusive in my language. One of the, one of the things, and I worry that I'm going to be offensive, and I wish this was the type of autistic I am. I know some people that are so good about just absorbing information and being able to synthesize it and then give a very succinct summary of what they've read. I do not have that gift. I think my ADHD takes over and I just want the abbreviated, what does it say? What do I need to do? When I learned about HSP, I really struggled initially having language to be able to succinctly describe what a highly sensitive person is. I've got that nailed down. I'm struggling in this with autism. It's just going to take some time. It is nice. Stephanie and this other therapist and myself have been compiling notes of things that we see, and maybe we'll do something with that would be helpful. But there are so many resources that are already out there. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephanie. Stephanie Gardner Wright, LMSW, is a licensed psychotherapist and mental health coach who specializes in supporting highly sensitive and neurodivergent folks. She hosts the podcast Sensitivity Sessions, supporting sensitive souls to find ease and purpose in an overstimulating world. After working with her, her clients have been able to reduce their anxiety, set better boundaries, manage their depression, and heal deep-seated traumas. Stephanie brings to her clients more than a decade of experience helping hundreds of individuals through her private practice and in both agency and community mental health settings. I think this is a great episode. I love this conversation that Stephanie and I had. We recorded it a few weeks ago. I've listened back to it a few times. I think it's great. Curious to know what you think. And now, on to the show. Hey, Stephanie, how are you?
Hello, doing well. How about you?
I'm good. I'm a little bit nervous. We were supposed to be 3 today, and the third person was going to facilitate, and I'm a little unprepared. And I'm also a little bit nervous I'm excited to talk to you about what our autistic experience has been like. And I feel really concerned about disenfranchising anybody who identifies as HSP or anything else. And I don't want to create divisiveness. And I feel like I'm kind of straddling this fence on how to talk about that. And I think especially since you and I are both autistic, I have a concern that I'm going to get so immersed in our conversation that part of me that monitors, am I being considerate of people that are non-autistic or maybe feeling like we have an agenda? So I just want to name that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can very much relate with what you're saying too, that feeling of straddling a fence, or in a way, straddling two worlds right now, and how to do that with delicacy and consideration. It's definitely an interesting journey.
Definitely. And I just think there's not enough research yet. I think there's just still not enough that we know. And so it makes it hard. So my hope was that maybe we could talk about some of the things that we're experiencing or encountering as we're going through this uncovering process, because we're both therapists who specialize in HSP and then learn that we're autistic. Both of us fairly recently, although I suspected for probably a good at least 6 months. How about you?
Let's see, it is June now, so 4 months at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I really had to sit with it for a long time because there's not, well, part of what you and I were talking about before we started recording is we've got the traditional, I feel like I'm struggling with my language, the things that we think about when we think of autism, which traditionally were very male, very stereotypical. Now we know that there's a female autism type. Again, my language is not precise. So if you have better language than I do, Stephanie, please jump in. And then it's possible, we don't have any proof on this, but that HSP can be a subtype of autism. So when we look in the literature now, there's a lot more descriptions of what autism looks like in women. But what I haven't seen, I have seen a number of creators, but I haven't seen any research that really talks about HSP being a subtype of autism. And for me, that's what really resonates more for me. How about for you?
Yeah, as someone who, when I've taken the HSP self-measure, I am like the highest number that you can get on that scale, the tippy top of the tippy top there. So I agree with you. I haven't really seen my personal experience reflected much in either memoirs or, some of them I can kind of relate with aspects here and there a little bit. Of course, everyone's life is different, but I haven't seen anything in the literature to date either where I really can go,
Right.
Yep, that's me. Other than maybe some of the research or kind of evolving research on some of the additional chronic health concerns that someone might experience along with that I can relate to more of, okay, in context, maybe some ongoing, either co-occurring mental health stuff or physical stuff. I can kind of relate more in context to that, but to the specific experience of a possible HSP subtype, I don't see that reflected currently.
Right.
Which is a shame.
The two resources that I can think of off the top of my head that appear to be current and relevant for women, although I'm sure there's much more, is Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. And then Samantha, I think it's Croft, Croft. And I can link to this in the show notes, where she has a guide to autistic traits in women. I was just reviewing some of them this morning, just coincidentally, not intentionally for this podcast. And some of the things that stuck in my mind it talks about being overly emotional and having poor regulation, which I think was probably true when I was younger. I was in therapy 30 years ago, so I've had 30 years to do healing work on a lot of my attachment injuries and learning how to self-regulate. So I don't relate as much to those things. And for me, I tend to be a very high control, not impulsive. I internalize so much. So I'm not one that's likely to have a meltdown because I know it wouldn't go well for me, but I have a lot of shutdowns. And I can be in a crisis situation and be very calm, probably because there's a part of me that just has learned to detach. So a lot of those descriptors about being highly emotional and reactive don't fit for me, but many people who are autistic have been misdiagnosed as having bipolar or borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety, although those can be co-occurring, and even OCD. In autistic brains, there's a need for order and things to be done in a certain way. And again, OCD can often be misdiagnosed if the person is autistic because of that need for order. So really being able to understand. And then, of course, complex PTSD. And the theory is that most autistics have experienced trauma. And it's not that trauma causes autism, it's how our brains come wired. But that is another factor to tease out. I want to give you a chance to talk because I feel like I'm dominating the conversation.
No, not at all. I'm learning, part of my personal autism is my processing is slower. It's just, kind of how my brain goes. So I kind of need some time to think. So it's actually really helpful to hear your thoughts and then have my own responses to those as you're sharing. What sticks out the most to me about what you're saying too is just the kind of the lack of crosstalk that we have across disciplines, which is great. We have folks like clinicians and therapists, psychologists, whatnot, who specialize in various fields or things like HSP or autism, for example, but it seems like there's not much cross communication between fields or between disciplines to where you can really share knowledge and either come up with some new ideas or kind of crystallize like what is the current best practice and the current best research, even because I know so much of this is still emerging and there is a lot of need for clinical discernment.
Yeah. What I love is that I'm taking notes as I'm talking, which I do not multitask. Can you multitask? Like, can you talk and do stuff at the same time? I can't either.
No, absolutely not. I never could, what is it? Rub your, is it your tummy or your head? Either one, and do the opposite.
I see these videos where people are cooking and talking or putting on makeup and talking. And like, I can't. Like, it's just one thing at a time.
Yeah.
But where more autistics are doing research, they're initiating the research, they're writing the research, they're analyzing the research. And I think that that's really important because, again, our brains are wired so differently and there's just not enough information. And our intention is just to share our experience so that you get a chance to see what does the lived experience of just two autistic women. If you've met two autistic women, you've met two autistic women. If we brought in somebody else and somebody else, there's such a spectrum and not a linear spectrum when it comes to autism. And that's one of the myths that you're less autistic, you're more autistic, but it's really more like a circle that it's a pie shape of where your strengths are and the areas that you struggle with. And again, I think that people want to understand, but it is not less autistic, more autistic, high functioning, low functioning. We just have low support needs, higher support needs. I've talked about if I wasn't married, I think I would not be managing as well because my husband has great executive functioning in the areas that I really struggle with. Without that, I don't think I'd have the life that I have today. But that's taken for granted. And when we look at statistics of the unemployment rates for people that are autistic, how many people are out there that are not diagnosed, that are engineers and computer programmers and all of these high-tech jobs, but do not know that they're autistic? The same with women, that I haven't had a problem being employed. And I just found out at almost 60 that I'm autistic. And so I don't know that the statistics also reflect very accurately because there are so many autistics that are undiagnosed.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to make too, because we have this certain picture of autism, and obviously it does fit for many autistic people, but also it does not fit for many of the folks that are maybe currently undiagnosed, or, for instance, 80% of women that remain undiagnosed at age 18. So there's maybe a lot that we don't know currently.
Yeah. And the high correlation between ADHD and autism is also 80%. And I hear a lot of people talking about ADHD, and it sure sounds a lot like autism. And again, the disciplines aren't talking to each other. And so there may be more similarities than differences. And we just don't have that information yet.
Right. Right. And I think it takes a lot of tolerance in some way to sit in this middle part at the moment and just be honest with ourselves and saying, we don't know. I mean, maybe there's some research that's happening, or we maybe have some thoughts that are necessary thoughts, but the reality is, do any of us really know for sure yet how these things are connected?
Right, right. Well, it's funny too that it wasn't my idea to do video today. It was, I don't know if it was yours or the other person that didn't join us. Do you recall whose idea it was to use video?
I do not remember.
And I tend to not want to do video because I do not make nobody has ever talked to me about making eye contact, so I don't consider that to be an issue. What I do know is that when I'm speaking, I do not look at who I've been observing. I look over here when I'm thinking. And when Jen and I record, we don't record video. And I can't tell you, as soon as we hit record, I have to cough. My dog is barking. I mute myself so I can cough, so I can itch. And I was talking to you and rubbing my eye, and I had this thought of, oh, we're on video. I shouldn't be doing that. So again, these are subtle things that if we're not conscious of them, we wouldn't even know. Like, this is why I prefer to podcast and do audio instead of video, because I think some of my idiosyncrasies show up more on video, and I don't really like that as much.
I hear that. Or for me, it was the recent realization of, oh, this is why I really have taken like a duck to water to doing telehealth sessions as a therapist, because I can move my feet, I can fidget with my hands, which really helps me to think and track clients are saying. But when I was in office doing traditional face-to-face in-office therapy for years prior to the pandemic, you'll feel a pretty intense amount of anxiety. And I'm realizing now it was because I couldn't move naturally in a way that I needed to.
Right.
So I very much hear that.
Right. And I think when we think about stimming, again, we think of very stereotypical, obvious movements. And I don't know about you, but I'm finding that I'm actually a vocal stimmer. And I really never knew that, because when I was a kid, I'd make noise at the table. And my dad couldn't stand it, and he told me not to. And because there was so much trauma in my childhood, and however I'm wired, I just stopped making noise. I remember being in school and thinking, like, you may have control of my body, but you don't have control over my mind. And so learning how to really contain and internalize an extreme amount of discomfort and not being present, but showing up externally looking like a well-behaved female. And it's interesting now starting to see this vocal stimming and how much I enjoy it, and being mindful of that when and where I do it. But it just brings me joy, and it's such a release. And I never would have even known.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. I think the way for me that vocal stimming shows up is there'll be kind of certain snatches of song or humming or silly songs that I make up, as I go along, that are very satisfying to do. And it just feels almost like scratching a really good itch, where it's like, this very satisfying feeling. But I do remember doing that as a kid, just making up my own songs about my cats or something, it's just, it's great.
When my kids were little, and I have a song that I made up for each one of them, and that was probably one of my favorite things, is I sang to them all the time, and we watched shows that had singing. And it's probably one of the ways that I managed my stress, because I didn't know about HSP back then. I certainly didn't know about autism. But some of my vocal stems are just like going like, "Brr, brr, brr." And I love
Mm-hmm.
sing-songy, rhymey things that in Aquafit, we do this thing. And sometimes the instructors call it something, but I love when they call it roly-poly. Like roly-poly, roly-poly, roly-poly. Like even just saying it makes me excited that there's something about the
Mm-hmm.
sing-songy things. And I started to think back to the books that I liked, all the Dr. Seuss that has lots of sing-songy, rhymey
Mm-hmm.
things, and how much I love nonsense, rhymey things, that is part of what brings me joy.
Absolutely. For me too, it's particular words. I was always very word oriented as a child. And even now, finding the right word, finding words that I like the way that they sound together. And if the meaning or even the etymology of something, and if I really am excited about that with how the word sounds. I remember sometimes just rolling over the sound of how a word would sound in my head, like, oh, that's a good word. Let's see how many times I can drop that word naturally into a sentence today.
Yep. And many autistics are hyperlexic. We learned to read very early. We were very verbal. We were very precocious. We liked to be around adults more than our peers or younger children. I don't know about you, but I read avidly. There was just not enough that I could devour. And just like you, language is very important to me. And I love finding the right word. And part of this is not correcting other people. Were you the kid who would also, in certain areas, a steel-tight drum around what somebody has said or what the rules are? So being great to be somebody's memory or a teacher's memory, but if you get the wrong person in your life, it feels like you're trying to control them, or then being chastised for not staying in your own lane. What of those things resonate or don't resonate for you?
Everything of what you just said. So I definitely had certain very close family members in my life, adult family, who would say, this is your thing with words, and you're my little walking thesaurus type of a thing. So feel free anytime I pronounce something wrong, or I'm searching for a word or need spelling help, help me. So then I would take that and kind of go, oh, well, must be that all adults in my family are happy with that. And that was not indeed the case. So, there were maybe one or two other family members that were quite offended that I corrected a word choice that they'd made, or something. That's not how you say that. And so then I had to kind of go, oh, this is not, in fact, how all adults view this. I'm seeing now, a special interest of mine was definitely reading. I read the entire adult mystery aisle, both sides, at my local library by probably the age of 9 or 10, and would read, 1 to 2 full fiction books a day after completing schoolwork. So it was definitely a special interest, and one that I got a lot of deep joy from, but not something that you look at a kid that wants to be nose deep in a book all the time and go, oh, well, that's the sign that they're autistic, because we think of reading as this very specific, we want our kids to read more. And we obviously have a lot of negative views of autistic special interests, unfortunately.
Right. I was asked to not bring books to school because all I wanted to do was to read. I didn't want to do my work. And my mom was very progressive in the schools that I went to, where we had work that we just had to accomplish by the end of the week. And I found that really difficult because I just wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I didn't want to do the things that were challenging or hard.
Yeah, I was really fortunate looking back in that regard, because I was homeschooled for every year but one. And so it was very much, here is our curriculum, but whatever your interest is regarding that, we are just going to go hard in that direction and still fulfill the learning requirements that we need, but in a way that would be of personal interest. So I know that is a very unusual experience. I'm very lucky for having that, because I can imagine if I went to a more traditional school like your experience, that I would have been really disengaged as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember in elementary school that we were doing math and I was able to solve problems not the way that the teacher was doing it. And I remember the teacher talking to my mom that I had this ability. I was so young that I can't remember what it was, but I just saw patterns and was able to solve things. And they didn't understand why I was doing it, but I was coming up with the correct answer. Math changed for me later on, but I also remember at some point saying, I like math because there was no ambiguity with it. It's always going to be this plus this equals that. And I appreciated that clarity, although I loved English and I loved language as well.
Math and I are not friends, but I remember it before hitting algebra, relating to that feeling of it's clear, and as long as I do the steps, I know what I'm getting, which there's a certain aspect of feeling reassured by that.
Yeah, absolutely. a couple things that I wanted to talk about, that it's really more to provide education. And this is where I hope that it doesn't come off as being unkind. And you and I talked a little bit before we recorded, so this hasn't been your experience, but I haven't shared with very many people that I'm autistic. By the time you hear this, the episode that I did, episode 195, where I talk about my autism, is coming out. And I've had this concern that occurred to me after I recorded it, and I'm still going to release it, that I think about you, the listeners are out there, but there are people that are in my life that listen to the podcast. And I've made a conscious choice not to share my autism diagnosis with very many people for I think good reason. And I am having this thought of, what if people start coming up and talking to me about my autism because they listen, and how can I respond? And I've had 2 experiences with people asking me about my autism. I've only responded to 2 people because it felt like what they were asking was, so I realized my hand is up in the air, like, oh yeah, we're recording. These are the things that I naturally do. And so that, this is masking. I put my hand down. That's masking. Don't have your hand up, because people don't do that.
Let your hand fly free.
I've noticed too, I've started to do this thing, like, what is this, my little talking puppet hand? And I use this a lot. And I'm thinking, that doesn't look very great. But anyways, I digress. So the first person that asked me that it felt good is also autistic. And it's somebody that I know through somebody else. And they asked, are you comfortable sharing with me what you saw that made you think that you were autistic? And I felt so seen when they asked it. So when somebody has asked me and it feels like they're really wanting to know more about my experience, I feel really connected and seen, and I want to share. I had somebody else ask me, and what it felt like is, I don't think this fits for you. I'm curious if it fits for me. So I want you to do the labor and tell me about this so I can decide if I accept this or not. And I've done this. So I've been on the other side of this. And I think this is very relatable to when we started going through all the education around racism. And we were looking to people of color, BIPOC, to do the educating for us. And they shouldn't have to be doing the labor that me, as a person of non-color, it's my job to my education around what is racism, where does my bias come from, where does my white fragility come from. That is not the responsibility of anybody who is a person of color. And it feels like it's very similar here, that if it's coming from a place of, I want to see if this fits for me, I don't know if I believe it is true for you, but I don't want to do the labor and I want you to do the labor. That's challenging for me because it feels very personal. And as you and I have talked, Stephanie, that I think part of what happens with this process of being diagnosed, even after diagnosis, and I'm in a couple of groups with a ton of autistic women, am I autistic? Am I not autistic? And so there's this constant doubt that we deal with. And I dealt with somebody who did not believe that I was autistic and wanted to make sure that I was getting the right resources and that everybody should be an expert. And it felt so invalidating because it bumped up against my own things that I'm just working through right now. I haven't been on this journey for very long. So I would encourage you that if you do have somebody that offers you information, to really do a check of, where are you coming from when you ask for information? I'm sure this is a terrible analogy, but for some reason it keeps coming up. It feels to me, I'm so afraid to say this, but if I told you that I had cancer and you're like, are you sure? Do you really know that it's cancer? Do you want to get a second opinion? Have you tried using vitamins? Not allowing me to be an expert in my own life. And I think that the greatest honor we can give people is trusting that people know what they're doing. And ask, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about being autistic? What's that been like for you? Do you want me to ask questions? How can I support you? Really focusing on the person and asking them how you can be there for them.
Yeah, I agree. And it hasn't been my personal experience yet, but it makes me think when we tend to come from that spot of maybe skepticism a little bit, or wanting to kind of investigate why someone is thinking what they're thinking about their own lives. I think it can often be because of a fear that we have, either some preconceived notions that we have, or a fear, or even attachment issue that things are kind of bumping up against if it's activating for us. So there's usually a lot of things connected there if we're, responding to someone in that way.
Yeah. And I think this sort of goes into this other thing of, I've had people say to me, like, you don't look autistic, you don't act autistic, you don't seem autistic. Mm-hmm. And what that says to me is that's because you really haven't done enough educating yourself about what autism in women look like. When that was said to me, that is not what I said, but this is what goes on for me internally. And I think that this is where it gets a little bit sticky. If you're an HSP or identify as an HSP and you've chosen to listen to this episode, there's a part of you that's curious. And I don't want to be in a place where I'm taking away anybody's belief in how they identify. And neurodivergent, we're all neurodivergent. And if it fits for you and you're curious and you want to learn more, then I'm all for it. But I don't want to take away anybody's identification from them. But this does end up bumping up. I know that this is not realistic to expect anybody to say, this is my autistic brain. I think what would feel good for me is if somebody said, gosh, I identify as HSP and you talking about being autistic feels a little threatening to me. And now it's making me wonder if I'm autistic and I'm curious to know what you saw. And there's also this thing of, well, aren't we all a little autistic? And no, we're not. It's like being pregnant. You're not a little pregnant. You're pregnant or you're not pregnant. And there are criteria for autism. And if you relate to some of the things that we're talking about, doesn't mean you're autistic, doesn't mean you're not autistic. But part of what was so helpful for me was starting to see the lived experience of people, what that looked like, to see women who were autistic and to go like, I didn't know they were autistic. And the judgments that I have about what autism looks like, and to have that stereotype really broken down and to see what it looks like on a daily basis and to be in groups where people are talking about things that I identify with. Because if I look at the criteria, I just feel like that's not me. That doesn't fit. And so it's really been an interesting process.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's so much value in just listening to lived experience and going, that's interesting. That really confronts my preconceived notions and stereotypes of what I thought this was. And there's a lot of good in that. And I think to see how different all of us as autistic can experience the world.
Right. I know that TikTok is very controversial. As you were talking, I was having this check and said, like, do I really want to say this? And this is, again, that fear that I'm going to be invalidated. And, this is what's true for me. TikTok has been invaluable in uncovering my autism diagnosis. And I can hear the voice of somebody that I know going, everybody's on TikTok. And last week, the fad was bendy bodies, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a very high comorbidity if you're autistic. There's a very high comorbidity of being genderqueer, gender questioning, transgender. There's a comorbidity with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia.
Yes, I'm sorry, I can't remember the particulars, but yes, POTS. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and MCAS, which is mast cell activation, that those are all high comorbidities. And TikTok has some amazing creators. There are PhDs on there. There are people that specialize in autism that are talking about what the lived experience looks like. It has been invaluable. And if you're someone who thinks that TikTok is just stealing all your information, there are people doing dances and you're not into it, that's fine. But I'm going to tell you that I have learned so much on TikTok. And because for some reason I still really cannot focus on reading, I have a very short attention span. TikTok can give me what I want in small bites. And a close friend of mine who's autistic hates TikTok and wants to go to YouTube where she can watch an hour-long video and really do a deep dive where I don't know if it's my ADHD and my autism, but like, give me the bottom line, cut to the chase, which is how I show up on the podcast. I want to tell you where we're going. What are we talking about? Let's get rid of the fluff. So again, everybody shows it very differently, but that was one of the things that was so helpful, is to see what does autism look like in women. And can't tell you how many therapists I see on TikTok that are autistic.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. That's our special interests, because we can also pick special interests that are more fit into our culture, that are things that we can blend a little bit more than having special interests that may be much more specialized that don't relate with the general population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been very interesting, just to see from my own recollection anyway, the amount of therapists that are on TikTok that are autistic too. It's like, oh, of course, because many of us, I'm not going to say all of us, but many of us that go into psychology and mental health, we're kind of learning from the inside out, how do people work, including myself? I want to get to the bottom of what makes people tick and their motives, and that can be such a source of endless fascination and empathy too, because so many of us do have very high empathy which is obviously contrary to the stereotype.
Right, right. I think also as a therapist, for me, a coach, that pattern recognition. I think we have a really great ability to see patterns in our clients and things that other people may not be able to see. It's not like it's magic, but we really are very good at recognizing repetition and patterns, and that really makes it great. One of the things that when you and this other person, I feel like it's her job to share who she is. So that's why I'm keeping her kind of anonymous. But the three of us met on a Zoom call maybe a week and a half ago. And I was talking about, I am autistic, but I still doubt. And when I first met this person back in 2018, there was something that I said to her, and she didn't know a lot about autism at the time, but she said, that was a very autistic thing to say. And then she ended the call and you and I stayed on. And then you also said, I clearly see traits in you that are autistic. And I felt validated. And then I got off the phone and then I went into almost a shame spiral about, oh my gosh, I know I'm different, but I feel like I show up in a way that is socially acceptable. But I really started to fear like, oh my gosh, am I doing these things that everybody else can see and I can't see? And I did reach out to her and I asked her and she said, no, it was just very insightful that part of what my autism looks like is really cutting straight to the core, being incredibly insightful about things and asking about it. And then I knew you had company that night. So I sat with my discomfort because we're in different time zones.
Yes.
And asked you the next day. And again, your feedback was about my depth of processing and my insight. But I'm sharing this because we can have mixed feelings about, when you learned you were an HSP, maybe it was a relief, maybe it felt scary, that our sense of who we are and how we show up and how do people see us and how do I see myself and what traits do I own for myself? Identity is huge. It really can be a huge thing.
Absolutely. And how we perceive ourselves in the world and in relation to other people is such a piece of that too. So it can feel like it's blowing everything wide open in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, from that conversation, I realized my boys are 23. And if you've been listening to the ongoing saga of my son, Josh, he was supposed to be deployed in May to get in the Navy. He signed in, he swore in, he signed his contract. There are some hangups and he's unemployed at this point. He's looking for a job because he thought he would have deployed by now. It's been very stressful and my heart goes out to this kid, and he stays very close to us about what's going on along the process. And after this other person made that comment about my insightful yet probing question, I realized, I know that when things are tough for especially Josh, this is a story I'm telling myself, that he tends to distance because I'm a soft place to fall and he feels things very deeply and he doesn't really appreciate that. So when he's going through hard times, I mirror that. So he creates a little bit more space and he's more inclined to reach out to his dad, which I'm fine with. But I also realize that I see something and I go straight for the kill in what I assume is going on. And maybe saying straight for the kill isn't the best wording, but I go straight to what I'm thinking is going on. And I think it's incredibly probing and deep and insightful. And not that I do therapy with my kids, but if he's one of my autistic friends or a client, that's very helpful. When you're a 23-year-old kid and you're just trying to keep your stuff together, you don't really need someone probing in the depths of your soul. And I didn't even realize that I did that. And so once I had this awareness, I did text him and say, hey, it's just come to my attention that this is something that I do. So if we're having a conversation and you don't want me to ask you questions, just tell me. And within the next couple of days, I was actually out paddling with a friend, but we were just sitting on our boats on the water at the bay. And he called me and I didn't take time to talk with him, but I could see that something was going on with him. And I just really got curious. And I think sometimes me asking those questions helps me feel close because I can see that something is going on, that he's in pain. And I think that helps me have a sense of calm and comfort. And like, that's not my job as a mom. My job is to be there to support him and to manage my own discomfort. So we talked later that day. And again, I refrained from asking any in-depth questions. And it's an awareness that it's just how I show up, but nobody ever said that I do it. Or if they did, I thought it was a good thing. So again, we just get more and more information and we can choose, how do we want to show up? How do we want to interact with people if it's going to support or not support the relationship?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's so interesting too, to just hear how this new realization of yourself has unfolded and how as we show up as therapists can be such a helpful thing, but then maybe in certain family relationships, we need to be a little flexible, which is easier said than done, right? It's a hard one.
Is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up?
Not top of mind for me. How about you?
Okay. Thank you for showing up and being here today. Can I ask you, did this feel too vulnerable? Because we decided we'd record and then we'd sit with it and decide if we wanted to release it. Do you need more time to process how you feel about it?
I don't think so. I don't feel like it was too vulnerable, so I'm good with it.
Okay. I'm just curious. I think I'm okay. I probably need to sit with it for a day or two and then listen back to it, but I think I'm okay. Yeah, I mean, this is just, it's one more layer being seen. And I'm sure when you started your podcast, I know for me, when I first started going on podcasts, I get so nauseous. I wouldn't throw up, but I would get so nauseous. And I knew that I was being vulnerable, and allowing ourselves to be seen on video and social media and podcasts. And then this is a whole new layer of
so much.
Allowing ourselves to be seen, and fear of criticism from the HS community that we're running out of bounds.
Yeah.
And making suppositions about things that we don't have research to back up. I don't want to alienate anybody, but I also was talking with my husband yesterday. We went out to breakfast and was talking about this episode that's being released and some of my concerns about people talking to me about my autism that I may not be people that I would choose to share with. I mean, I really have only shared with a very select few people. And how do I navigate that? But I was thinking about if one or two people listen to any of these episodes and start thinking, gosh, HSP didn't quite fit. It feels like there's something that's missing. And they go on to get an autism diagnosis or self-diagnose, which is totally valid. And they learn more about themselves, and I'm really willing to bear the potential discomfort that I may have to deal with in my personal life, because one of my very strong values is wanting people to know there's nothing wrong with you and how we come wired is okay. And as I'm learning more about me, I want people to have that option to go, does this fit? Does it not fit? But I don't have an agenda about now everybody has to go get a diagnosis. It's just more information that may help you understand yourself. And it's given me permission to not do certain things because, like, I'm really clear as an autistic person, that doesn't serve me. Nope, not going to do it.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much because it's like this whole other solar system level, being vulnerable to explore this new identity publicly, and as we're both just figuring out in our own ways. So I'm going to blank on the exact statistic, but the thing that I come back to too is this helps 1 or 2 people because of the suicide rate with autism. And I'm blanking on the exact rates, but I know they are very high, much higher than the general population. And actually, women who are autistic will successfully complete suicide more than men. So it's truly a life or death situation. So I agree. I think presenting the information, and then folks can decide if it fits for them. If it doesn't, they get to decide always. I don't know individuals and their lives. So I'm a big believer too, that information is power and we shouldn't withhold possibilities from people.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else before we go?
I think I'm good for today.
It's been such a joy connecting with you. I'd seen your TikToks, and then I saw you post that you were autistic on Instagram, and I reached out to you, and we've just had this sweet, sweet, sweet connection that I feel like I've known you for a million years.
Likewise, it's been so lovely. The timing with you reaching out, and I was feeling very vulnerable and exposed, like, okay, I've just shared this very personal thing, on the internet, and it's been so wonderful to be able to connect and feel like there's been this long-standing knowing of each other at the same time.
Yeah. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for chatting with me.
Have a good one.
You too.
Bye. Hey again. So I'm curious to know, how was this episode for you? Did it annoy you? Did it make you feel prickly? Did it make you feel angry? Did you hear things that you resonated with? Are you trying to figure out if maybe you're autistic? Maybe you know someone who might be autistic? My goal is really just to provide information. If you're curious about autism, I cannot diagnose. I'm new in this process. I am working with a handful of people that I suspected that they were autistic, and they're in the process of getting diagnosed. One person has gone on to get a diagnosis. Everybody that's getting diagnosed right now, you do certain stages, and you pay for, the first stage, and then they let you know what the results were. And if you want to proceed, you go on to the second stage. And so far, they're moving through all the stages. If you want to schedule a session with me to talk about it, if you have some questions, again, this is not my area of expertise, meaning it's not what I studied, but I can tell you that I have put in hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours learning about this because guess what? It's my special interest. So if you want to set up a free 20-minute consult, I would chat with you about it. But if you want to schedule a session with me, you're welcome to. If this is bringing up stuff for you, shoot me an email. I don't know what to say. It's okay. It's okay to get upset. It really, really made me angry when I was in a large group for neurodiversity, for neurodiverse therapists, and wanted to be there as an HSP. And the autistic said, all HSPs are autistic. I felt incredibly, incredibly offended. And now here I am. So we all have our process. We move through things. If there's anything that I can do to support you, I'm great with relationships and codependency and boundaries and perfectionism, ADHD, having a hard time getting stuff done, being sensitive, just all the stuff we talk about, attachment, parenting, challenging kids. We're all neurodivergent in our household, so I know about that. You can reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive.com. That's my website. There's a contact page. Stephanie's website is www.stephanie, Stephanie, Gardner, Gardner, Wright, WRIGHT.com. And I will have that in the show notes. And I don't know if she's accepting clients or not. I think that's all I have. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. You have a right to be here. You have a right to take up space. It's okay if not everybody gets you. Not everybody understands you or appreciates you. You have gifts and special talents to offer the world. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything to earn your worth or your value. How your brain works, how you show up in the world, how you communicate is perfect. If there are things you want to change, that's okay. But there is nothing that is fundamentally wrong or flawed with you, that you have special things to offer the world. You matter. You make a difference. Have a blessed day.